Welcome to this discussion, which has been entitled by the club Somaliland, Getting It Right in Africa. And it's part of the Frontline Club's Somalia season. And our panel is Adam Musa Jibril, who's been the Somaliland representative in the United Kingdom since January of this year. Michael Walls, chair of Somaliland Focus, established in London in 2005 by a group of individuals with an interest in Somaliland. Also chair, I think, of the Anglo-Somali Society and coordinator of the UK International Observer Team for the forthcoming Somaliland elections, now forthcoming, I gather, probably in the early part of next year. And for good measure too, he's a lecturer in development planning at University College London. Also by Edward Mason, head of the London office of Independent Diplomats and Independent Diplomats expert on Somaliland. And last but by no means least, Richard Dowden, director of the Royal African Society, formerly Africa editor, both of the Independent and the Economist, and author of, there it is, Africa, Altered States, Ordinary Miracles, which is to be launched next week. Before perhaps I explain how I propose we run the discussion, one question please to be answered very briefly by each of you, all four of you. Our title this evening implies a proposition not only that Somaliland is working well, but also that it's demonstrating progress that is an example for Africa. So around you quickly, ideally in a sentence, do you agree?
Yes, I certainly do. I mean, I think it's an example of bottom-up process and successful democracy.
Well, Somaliland has been given many adjectives, names as a ways of peace and development, country of hope, and so on and so forth. But these actually positive images represent a relative truth and not absolute. That means we have also our problems.
Good. An enigmatic response there, a relative truth but not an absolute one. Michael Walls?
I'll go with the relative truth. Yes, it is an example in many, many ways, but there are enormous challenges, and you can't see the picture without both sides of it.
And Richard?
Yes, it had all the ingredients of total catastrophe, and it avoided it.
Short and simple. We will hear first from two members of our panel, Michael Walls and Adam Musa Jibril. Then we'll take a question or two on what they have said, and then our other two speakers, and open things up to a wider debate. I was once given advice early on in my own journalistic career that if you suddenly and unexpectedly find yourself having an interview to do with an interview that you have to do with a political leader of a country, and you know little or perhaps nothing at all of what is going on there, and you've had no time at all to do any homework, and you'd be surprised how often that's the case. Try just asking, I was told, one very general opening question, and if you can't think of any second question, then try this challenge. But surely the situation is very different in the south of your country. If you try it, it actually works for a surprising number of countries. And I suppose in the case of Somaliland and its political leaders, you might even say that it's a pretty good question there. A thumbnail sketch, perhaps, of Somaliland's recent history, if anybody needs it at all. I can't imagine that there are any of you who do, but just in case you do, Somaliland was a British protectorate for close to 80 years. It attained independence as the state of Somaliland on June the 26th, 1960. The part of Somalia that had been under Italian colonial rule, briefly after that under British administration, and then a UN trust territory, gained its independence 5 days later on July the 1st, 1960. and the two territories then formed a union. Now, those 5 days, I understand, become very significant in Somaliland's case today for international recognition. Somaliland declared independence from the rest of Somalia unilaterally in May 1991, and Somaliland's past since then, of course, has indeed been markedly different. Well, let's first of all hear more from Michael Walls. You chose to say that it's been a relative truth that Somaliland is getting it right and a model for the rest of Africa. First of all, perhaps you could give us a picture of life in Somaliland today, perhaps for those who aren't completely familiar with it, for whom it isn't their own homeland, they're not associated with it, a picture of life there, and then what you believe to be the important issues around Somaliland at this time.
I'm not sure where to start on a picture. I think there are other people in the audience that could, and on the panel, that could paint the picture a lot more authoritatively than I can. But it is the territory of Somaliland, and there is a map up there, so you can see in the northwest corner there the bit that is Somaliland. It's a poor country, although actually has a higher per capita GDP than any of its neighbours, with the exception of the ones in the south and east. Trade is a very big part of life and has been for generations. The lifestyle is very affected by that. So the staple diet is not based on things that are grown there, produced there. It's based on things like, well, except for the meat and the camel milk. It's based in large part on things that are brought in from elsewhere, not least the stuff that you chew from Ethiopia, khat, which plays rather a large part in the daily life of many men in the area. But it's a peaceful area. It's a very interesting area. It's geographically fascinating and socially fascinating as well. Maybe I'll add a little more to that picture as I go along, although that's not what I'm aiming to do per se, but I hope that gives a flavour. In fact, what I have is 5 to 10 minutes to give a background on Somaliland, which is a challenging task. And I've taken the step of actually writing down what I'm going to say, because if I don't write it down, then I'm not going to use that 5 to 10 minutes very constructively. But I want to start off on sort of situating this discussion in, I think, the rest of this Somali week in the Frontline Club, because very often the focus on Somalia is on Mogadishu as a proxy for Somalia, including Somaliland. And that sort of is used to support a circular logic that Somalia is a paradigmatic example of a failed state in which violence and anarchy are the norm. And footage from journalists perched typically on the rooftop of some Mogadishu hotel, dodging bullets and pointing out plumes of smoke from street-side bombs, supports that generalization. The reality, of course, is different. Both history and the contemporary situation, and I do mean history, not just Somaliland now, are examples of successful peace and state building, or have offered examples of successful peace and state building that have taken place and continue to take place in the indigenous Somali context. Somaliland since 1991 is one, but only one such example. It's an instructive one. Nevertheless, it tends to be dismissed as a good news story that consequently lacks the necessary angle to make it newsworthy. That simultaneously belittles Somaliland's achievements, trivializes their continuing challenges, and in international eyes, ties Somaliland inescapably to the fortunes of an ineffective and widely unpopular Mogadishu-based regime. On the 18th of May 1991, Somaliland declared that they had restored the sovereignty they enjoyed for 5 days in 1960. As Mike said, that's a significant 5 days in that argument. That declaration of a return to colonial borders received wide, though naturally not universal, support from those living in the territory. Indeed, the leadership of the SNM had to be persuaded to take the step of declaring independence by the strength of popular feeling. The leadership of the SNM being the nationalist resistance movement based in Somaliland that was fighting the government of Siad Barre and won the war in 1991. So they weren't in favour of secession. They weren't supporting secession. They were forced into that position by the strength of public opinion. The Declaration of Independence came at the start of a process of peace and state building that covered almost 40 conferences. By my count, 39. Some people say 35. It depends which ones you count and which ones you don't count. They occurred throughout the territory of the old British Protectorate, literally throughout, from end to end, all of the major clans in the territory were actively involved, and by major I mean all of the clans apart from the minority clans, who traditionally don't have a substantial say in the issues of political decision-making. The Wasangali and Eastern Sanag remain sceptical of Somaliland's future as an independent state, and the Dubahante clan, both of these are in the eastern portion, in Sanag and Seoul on the map over there. The Dubahante clan were and remain divided on the issue. However, the vast majority supported independence when it came. While clan, though, has played a huge part in the process, it's a dynamic role. Alliances shift and form on the basis of both clan and non-clan interests. Groups like Alan As, which means red flag, in fact, not really a group so much as a loose coalition of individuals who sometimes didn't and don't see themselves as operating in the same group as each other, have played a varied and contested role in the peace process, and often they represent things from a non-clan perspective, or set out to do so. As dynamic as it was, though, that process of meetings and conferences, the 40 meetings or 39 meetings, did follow a broadly discernible pattern. Local issues were invariably dealt with first. In that context, agreements tended to revolve around a clan assumption of responsibility for all actions taken within traditional grazing areas, which in itself was a break with much tradition, because the setting of of grazing areas with borders, the borders became a lot more fixed after that. Those kinds of agreements were formed. And where the civil war had been particularly messy, an acceptance was reached that there would be no attempt to calculate compensation payments relating to agreed periods of conflict. That latter phenomenon has many names, two of which are Dutsi, which just means to reject or refute the past, and to agree to not remember it, so to speak, or Hale Delay, which means born yesterday. Someone born yesterday can carry forward no grievance. So the agreements are that it is that grievances will not be remembered between groups, although within groups they still are. And that runs counter to the traditional practice of calculating and paying specified compensation for death, injury, or loss of property at the hands of another party. It also runs counter to the principle, interestingly, I think, of truth and reconciliation, restorative justice, truth-telling, that are so beloved of peace researchers everywhere, and I suspect a good many journalists. Also fundamental to the processes employed in Somaliland is the pursuit of consensus. To many, that either sounds like a woolly and unworkable ideal, or a pacific and socially enlightened mode of operation. It isn't necessarily either. Somali traditions of consensus-based socio-political organisation are old and have worked well in the process of resource management in a marginal environment for many generations. They have also supported a system in which recourse to violence is, on the one hand, frequent, and on the other, usually controlled. It's true also that the challenges of adapting such a system to the political economy of the contemporary nation-state presents a substantial challenge. However much systems such as that in Switzerland, or various cases of participatory budgeting in Latin America and the like, are held up as examples, consensus-based democracy has been comprehensively and internationally trumped by representative forms. Consensus systems do tend to be slower and less efficient at decision-making than their representative cousins, and the Somaliland conferences of 1991 to 97 reflected this, as does the current political environment. However, the conferences enabled by 1997 the remarkable resolution of outstanding issues to a sufficient degree that the periodic conflicts of that period were concluded, and the civilian government was able to consolidate its position. Local, lower house and presidential elections have all been held successfully, and a shift in the balance of power in Parliament has occurred without violence. The presidential context also famously saw the incumbent retain power by a wafer-thin majority. On the election night it was 80 votes, with the opposition candidate conceding defeat without violence, a remarkable occurrence in most areas, not just in Africa, not just in the Horn of Africa. However, only a portion of the process is complete. The upper house or Gerti, which the Constitution says, and I quote, shall be elected in a manner to be determined by law, remains unelected. There is no mechanism for the three legal parties to change, to die, for new ones to emerge, and the lower house is so far unable to exercise a real check on executive power, even on the matter of the budget, which is technically directly under their control. Many in Sanaag and Seoul regions, the two that I mentioned before in the east, that where the Wasangali and Dobahanti are predominantly based, have become disillusioned with the state, and recent political and constitutional crises suggest a hardening of positions that is not conducive to resolution. And I am deliberately calling them crises, in spite of the fact that I copped considerable flack in the recent past for use of the same word, because I believe they are crises. They are political and constitutional crises. Riots have also recently broken out in Hargeisa on 2 occasions over apparently trivial issues, which suggests a dangerous sense of dissatisfaction with the current situation. So the challenges are substantial. In the immediate future, presidential elections are scheduled, as Mike mentioned, for the end of March 2009. However, a perhaps over-ambitious voter registration program is progressing in faltering steps. It's overseen by an inexperienced and often ineffective National Electoral Commission. If that presidential election does take place on time, or close to the scheduled date though, and without violence or widespread malpractice, then regardless of the outcome, it will mark a step that, in my opinion, is as significant as the transition to civilian government that took place in Boroma in 1993, or the meetings that ended the Civil War and declared independence in 1991. So far, the Somaliland polity has displayed a remarkable resilience. A feature of the consensus system is that the crises I referred to earlier are more frequent than they might be, but they have so far resulted in workable solutions. I'm optimistic that the process will continue, but it is fragile, and I could easily be wrong. If Somaliland does continue to progress down a path in which independent and democratic social and political institutions become increasingly established, that path will be difficult and fractious, but the achievement will be astonishing. My hope is that those of us who are not part of that system can play a constructive role, neither intervening with scarce understanding of the situation and consequently adding to the appalling sequence of blundering interventions that have characterized engagement in the South, nor marginalizing and ignoring what can still be seen as an all too rare success story in an area that is usually considered one of Africa's most problematic.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Adam Musa Jibril, I mean, both as Somaliland's representative here, but also as a journalist yourself, is that an assessment that you would agree with? I mean, Michael was obviously concluded there saying that he's pretty optimistic about the future, but obviously offering plenty of concerns really, and warning signs as well, and describing it as fragile.
Yes, I really do agree. Michael was, I think, he was very clear and comprehensive in his presentation. I will try to take up some points which I think there is a need to further explanation.
Sure.
Mainly what other peoples can learn from Somaliland experience. This is one point. I will go back also to highlight some historical background. I will start a question. I think outside observers, those who understand the issue, of course, but usually, generally, it's not known. That is, these achievements realized for Somaliland for the last 70 years of independence. Let me say reassertion of the Somaliland independence. Why these achievements? Why Somaliland has been able to achieve this democratization, peace building process? Here, I think we need to go back to the days of SNM, Somaliland, Somali National Movement, the structure, the democratic actually essence of the organization. SNM has been organization which started army struggle from 1981. Why army struggle was necessary is a very important question, because there was no other way open for the Somaliland people rather than army struggle. During army struggle, SNM has adopted a program which was based on both traditional customary law of the Somaliland people, and also which included in the modern aspect of constitutionalism. There was a structure of SNM. The Central Committee and Executive Committee represented the modern aspect of the society, while the Council of Elders, what we call Gurti, represented the traditional aspect of the society. These two dimensions of democracy, pastoral democracy, what Professor Am Lewis called pastoral democracy, and modern democracy. SNM has organized 6 congresses from 1981 to 1991. These 6 congresses, in each congress except one, the leadership of SNM has been changed peacefully and democratically. That is why we say the democratization process of Somaliland goes back to the SNM days, Somali National Movement days. This is one point. The other point I want to clarify is that the conflict resolution, traditional mechanism of conflict resolution, is based on tradition, traditional system of the society, which has been intact, endured over the ages, which British colonial administration did not actually try to change it. British administration, colonial administration, ruled Somaliland indirectly, as elsewhere in Africa, for instance, Nigeria. That is why our traditional system was intact, and that is why when SNM liberated the country, traditionally they started calling Somaliland All Communities Conference, which was a peace and reconciliation conferences. It started the principles of forgiveness and reconciliation. These principles of forgiveness and reconciliation was the basis of the achievements that Somaliland has gained for the last 70 years. The third point I want to underline is that these achievements Somaliland has realized. It's also based on modern aspect of the society, because here we had a different education system from Somalia. That was a British education system, which had also something to do with tradition. Because as you know, the British society has also traditional dimension, while in other European major countries, as you know, it was French Revolution and Napoleonic continental system that has, contributed to change the traditional institutions in Europe. That is also the situation in Somaliland. Now, Somaliland has actually, as I said, these positive images are not absolute truth. We have also our problems, difficulties. These problems and difficulties constitute, I will mention only three aspects of these problems. One is, of course, international isolation. We are not recognized in spite of this all process of achievements. The second point is of the problem we face is that actually in this stage of democratization, where political parties have just recently formed, and with lack of culture of democratic experience, because for the last during Siad Barre time, for the last almost 20 years, the country has never knew democratic institutions. So the culture of this generation of political elite are, lack, democratic practice. So we are just starting these political parties. There is a lot of problems, but we keep, of course, building political parties from the point of view of organizational level. Internal party democracy is also one aspect that within the building political parties. But the main obstacle here remain, to be actually scarcity of resources, financial resources. There is a lot of resources in the country, but these resources are, of course, underutilized and exploited natural resources. So, in spite of all this, we consider that Somaliland achievements are reached in a stage where some people will believe that it's irreversible. Of course, it can be reservable, but this is what conflict resolution and crisis management is a main, culture that we think we can overcome the future problems.
Thank you very much indeed. I was just going to ask you actually to pause there, but you've done so. Thanks very much indeed, just so we can get the maximum chance for the audience to ask questions. And indeed, we pause to do that. Are there any questions that specifically address the points that have been made so far, in essence laying out to how things have reached where they are today? Yep. We'll take just 2 or 3 questions at this point. Everybody else will have a chance later.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much. My name is Ali Ahmed. I'm Somali, who lives in here in London. I have a question for the panel, and one of it is that you mentioned basically the problem of having a clan issue, especially Dhulbahante and Orsangeli, who does not basically agree with the secession of Somaliland, and their loyalty rather lies with Bosaso than in Hargeisa because of clan issues. How would that affect or will be obstacle to Somaliland independence? And that is one issue. Another issue is that the Somalia is becoming a model of every tribe calling the area Puntland and Mudug State, Galmaheri State, and it goes on and on. Will that constitute basically another issue of face of another problem for New Somalia? And one more issue, sorry, is that
2 parts is
yeah, and one more issue is to do with the regional stuff, which is like, for example, in Africa, they all left the post-colonial borders, as it were. The EU accepted that, and Ethiopia is having a problem within inside it, whether it's Oromo or Ogaden regions. And will that be also an obstacle for Somaliland independence? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Michael, do you want to take that? Do you want to just perhaps summarise that? Could everybody hear the question or not? Yeah? Good. Okay.
If the summary of this, I'll do one at a time. The first, the Dhulbahante Wasangeli issue, it's as dynamic as all the other issues that I raised. The Wasangeli have never been fully on board with Somaliland. They've gone along with it. But there's been a fairly high degree of distrust of the idea of Somaliland. Dhulbahante have always been split, and they've moved much more in one direction or another. So in 1991, Dhulbahante mostly were very, very much on board with the Declaration of Independence. Since then, they've drifted away. They've become disillusioned with it, and they've aligned themselves again with Puntland. Yes, that is an issue. At the moment, maybe it's shifted back again. I don't know how much you know about the recent fighting over Lasanod, which Somaliland reasserted its control over with surprising success, I must say. And perhaps that. And there have been declarations from the Dhulbahante accepting that. So perhaps it's shifted back in Somaliland's favour to that extent. But yes, it is an issue. And it's very hard to say sort of how that will go. It depends on the negotiations with those clans within Somaliland, with Puntland, the success or failure of Puntland, and so on. The second question, I think, was, does the establishment of various clan-based polities throughout the Somali area affect Somaliland? To some extent, although most of those have been sadly abysmal failures. There have been a number of rise and fall. Puntland is the most coherent of those, and it's the most completely clan-based in the sense that it's almost it's overwhelmingly a Majaten area. Even Somaliland is less Isak than Puntland is Majaten. So to that extent, only Puntland has really been shown any sign of surviving, and even that now is in grave danger of completely falling apart. So I'm not sure that is the main problem. The last one, very briefly, Ethiopia. Yes, Ethiopia has significant problems within its borders. And I don't know how that will play out. I don't know how that will affect Somaliland's position or the position in Somalia. Ethiopia has always played a huge role in Somali politics and will continue to do so. The current situation in Mogadishu is not, or in South Central is not really new.
Yeah,
very briefly.
Yes, just briefly. I think as to dispute Lasanod, Dhulbahante area between Somaliland and Puntland, the Somaliland position is that we solve this problem through reconciliation and forgiveness. This is the fundamental approach for all conflicts. Even we believe that within Lubhante themselves there are some differences. Part of them they are supporting Somaliland, the other part they supporting Puntland as a clan, hearty point of view. But the main thing here is that actually the issue of clan is not an alternative for entities or peaceful resolution. We need Somaliland, as a Somaliland, has been an independent country before unity with Somalia. This Somaliland stands for democracy and for peace in the region, in the entire region, and there are some ideas that in the future reconciliation with Somalia, with Ethiopia. We believe that political disengagement with Somalia doesn't mean that Somali people are not, brothers, are not, the point is only Somaliland wants political disengagement with Somalia, and maybe in the future, economic and cultural reintegration with the entire countries of the regions.
Thanks very much, Nate. At the risk of offending you, if absolutely everybody in the room knows exactly where Puntland is, the semi-autonomous region, isn't it, that people call it, of Somalia that immediately borders Somaliland to the east of it. Time moves on a little bit. Could I just take one more question here, and then anybody else still got their hand up can come back with one after. Okay, you both had them up equally, I think, but maybe I'll take this. Yep. Sorry, I will.
Yes, good evening, everybody. My name's Norman Terrett. I'm just back from Somaliland. I would like to ask a question to you, Michael, regarding the forthcoming elections. I'm a bit vague. Who's paying for these elections? How are they being managed? And so on. And what effect, in fact, you feel they may have if it's shown to be democratic, if the country's shown to be democratic? Thank you.
Okay, that's relatively easy. The European Commission is overwhelmingly paying for the elections. The Somaliland government is contributing some money and resources, but most of the actual cash is coming from Europe. If they are successful and democratic, I don't know whether they're going to suddenly open the floodgates to recognition. I suspect not. But it would be, for my money, it would be a significant step forward, a very significant step forward, to have another presidential election that went smoothly, whatever the result. So it would certainly contribute significantly, but I don't know that it would be the magic bullet.
Okay. Actually, I will just take because I know you all put up your hands together. I think. Yep. One more question here for me.
There are a number of paradoxes about
Could you just wait for the microphone for 1 moment? Thanks.
I mean, Steve Kibble from Progressio, which has an office in Hargeisa. There are a number of paradoxes, I think, about Somaliland. I mean, firstly, the tie-in of the democratization process to recognition means, I think, that the understanding of democracy is not as fully fledged as it might be, which means that threats from civil society, the emergence of civil society is sometimes seen as a threat. And I think you have another paradox in the fact that the state is strong in the political arena, but is completely absent from the economic arena. The third one would be that despite the SNM winning the liberation struggle, it seems to have ceded power to personnel from the old Siad Barre security apparatus. And the fourth might well be that questions of identity, particularly on the eastern region, between territory from British Somaliland and clan from the fourth, which I think means that when you have the emergence of something like the Euronet human rights organisation, that the state is unable to deal with that and finds it very difficult not to revert to a kind of authoritarian mindset. So I wouldn't mind a thought from Adam and from Michael on that. Thank you.
And you first, Adam. And perhaps begin with that suggestion that civil society could be seen as a threat.
No,
As it is
I disagree with this. Kevla, you know, civil society is a very strong section of the society. Somaliland civil society has contributed a lot in the construction, building, in human rights, you know,
that may be not seen with any suspicion, as Steve was suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, civil society. There is no contradiction between civil society and the institutions, government institutions. They work together. Some problems can appear there, but as you know, we really been able to solve these problems through consensus, always consensus.
And in response to the other point?
The other point was...
Which one do you most want addressed? I mean, in a way you gave it as a bit of a commentary on what Adam Musajibil had said, but...
I think the issue of the human rights organisation being completely independent of the government has still not been fixed, and it's still a major problem, which seems to illustrate the lack of complete understanding of democracy inside Somalia.
So the space in Somaliland for the raising of human rights issues, that's the challenge to you, if you like.
Well, of course, you know, we have free press. We have 3 televisions, 1 governmental and 2 private. This is a battle of ideas, of course, you see. Different interests, different interest groups. As you know, sometimes you see even exaggeration of issues like human rights abuses, and both of you know that sometimes exaggerate. But I don't deny that this is a human nature whenever there is a government. But I want to tell you, the institution building in Somaliland has many contradictory aspects. You see, Somaliland needs to centralize institutions, government institutions, but in the same time, we need to decentralize, and they are, contradictory process, a very difficult process.
Okay, we'll pause there to return to the presentations, if we can call them that, and come back to questions a little bit later. Richard, your picture of Somaliland as you see it, and could you also maybe address as you go on the question of how far this is or isn't a model for elsewhere in Africa?
Thanks. I've only been a visitor, a traveller in Somaliland. First of all, before all this happened in the 80s, and then as it happened, I crossed over from Djibouti across the border with the SNM and headed towards Hargeisa, but never quite made it. But spent some time with the SNM in what is now Somaliland, and then I was there at independence. Actually, that's not quite true. There were a small group of journalists went there, and we were a week late. And they said, "Oh, but you have cameras and television things, so we'll do it all again." And so I was at the second independence and have the pictures to prove it. And it was a wonderful occasion. I'm not quite sure where to start, but I'll let me try this. It's basically, it's all about India. Why were the Brits there in the first place? They were there because the Red Sea is the route to India. And India, as you all know, was completely British and never more would be so. And the route to India was the jugular of Britain. I mean, this was absolutely to be protected at all costs. And the French were building a base at Djibouti, which you see up the top left-hand corner. So the British then had their base at Aden across the other side of the Red Sea. But how do you feed Aden? Well, here was this wonderful land, Somalia, lots of meat and so on. So they took Somaliland in order to supply Aden. That's why the British were there. It's because of India. But having arrived there, they were, I stand to be corrected, but I was surprised at how popular the British still seem to be right the way through this period. And I can remember being at the Buraq conference just after independence, as it started, and I attended the first few days of it. And these two wonderful old men in their maquis and their sticks, and they said, "Are you from Britain?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, come and have some tea." So we sat down, and they said, "We wish to apologise." Well, usually it's the Brits who would be apologising, but fine. He said, "We made a very big mistake in 1960. We had independence, and the British told us, stay just as Somaliland. But we didn't. We wanted a united Somalia. From Britain we had learned about law and justice and global matters. But of course, we didn't realise in the south they had the Italians. Spaghetti, the mafia, corruption. They had terrible people. And we agreed to go in with them. And it was a complete disaster, and we should never have done it. So those 5 days were being reassessed, I felt, at that time. Now, I think the reason for the reassessment I saw in Hargeisa at that time. And I was in Beirut during the bad times. I've been in other cities that have been utterly destroyed. I mean, and I've seen pictures of Hiroshima, we've all seen it. I have never been anywhere where the destruction was as total as it was in Hargeisa. It was absolutely unbelievable. There was I don't think there was one house in the city with the roof still on it.
Absolutely.
And what had happened was that the SNM had attacked the city and held a little bit of it. And the Siad Barre government had recruited Rhodesian pilots for their MiGs and was simply sitting in the airport with masses of bombs and ammunition. And they would load up, take off, and they would fly a mile, 2 miles, drop their bombs, come back and re-arm. So they were just dropping these 2 MiGs, which were still there when I was there, just dropping bombs on the city day and night, non-stop. And then the whole city, one night, and people can tell me how this happened, but they just decided that enough of this, and they moved out. There was sort of biblical migration out of the city, 2 or 3 days, no food, no water, across into Ethiopia. The whole city, and it was completely abandoned. And even then, what they were finding as people were drifting back at that time, and I still can't quite believe it, they had people had tried to bury their possessions in their houses. And in a lot of places, the Siad Barre soldiers come and dug them up, found them, and replaced them with landmines, with grenades and things. So people coming back to their homes were then killed as they try to find their possessions. Every day you would hear explosions from around the city because they had also mined the airport and all of that area. Sometimes it was camels, sometimes it was people losing a leg or just being blown away completely. So even when they came back, death stayed with them. The SNM, as Michael said, I mean, they were not in favour of independence, but they were frightened of the people. Tour actually admitted this to me. I interviewed him with a tape recorder, but then I turned it off, and he said, actually, we're not in favour of independence. We would like to hold it, and I thought this was quite wise, we'd like to hold it as a threat. So we will rule ourselves, and unless you guys behave yourselves, we will go independent, but we would use it as a political tool to get some leverage on the South to come together. And they were forced by the anger of the people, an anger that was very understandable, to go for complete independence, total, permanent. And I think that was, you could see why they did it, but it was I think it was a mistake. Now, you raised the problem of democracy there, and when it's not quite understood, but I found it refreshingly democratic. I've been back several times, and I can remember the best time was was having dinner with a minister one night, and the waiter came up and saw that it was the minister and started having a go at him. Well, I thought, in Britain, if, a waiter started having a go at a minister in somebody's restaurant, that would be pretty amazing. But this was even more amazing because the minister had to stand up and defend himself. And there's the minister and the waiter having a shouting match. And I thought, well, to me, that's pretty democratic. It was quite amazing, that sort of individual self-confidence, which I thought was just was quite extraordinary. I think the problem with the independence thing is still about that five-pointed flag, and that's what nobody's mentioned yet. But I think I'll just chuck it in as a final thing. The Somali flag is a blue flag with a five-pointed star, and those 5 points are Somalia, as you see it there, Somaliland, the British bit, Djibouti, Ethiopia. That map, if that was Somalia as it should be in terms of ethnic Somalis, all of that land you see on that map would be Somalia. But it was taken and given to Ethiopia by the European powers. Ethiopia was, of course, the other non-European power at the Congress of Berlin and benefited hugely from European imperialism in Africa, and were given the Ogaden, that whole part which says Ethiopia there. And the the five-pointed star of Somalia is about reclaiming the total Somalia, and that quite a lot of Kenya belongs to it as well. That's one of the things that I find particularly amusing about the current. His name's gone out of my head. The president of Somalia at the moment.
Abdullah Yusuf.
Abdullah Yusuf. I mean, he was the man who actually got closest to Addis Ababa when Somalia attacked to try and reunite the country in the great Ethiopia-Somalia war. And yet here he was brought back and put in power by Ethiopia, the very people he tried to attack before. And a Somali journalist said to him, when were you right the first time you went to Addis Ababa, or the second time when you went to beg to help, install you as president? And he just said, I was right both times. But I still think that belief in Somali unity of all the bits of Somalia, including Djibouti and the Ogaden, I think, remains a deep-seated dream among Somali people. And that, as long as it is divided by these lines, I think there is a problem.
We'll come back to
All right,
that.
okay.
No. Richard,
right.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take the liberty of just interpreting you to try and get one more sentence out of you, which is that particularly perhaps your waiter and the minister story suggests that you do think that much about Somaliland is getting it right in Africa, which is part of our title and one of the issues we're addressing, how far this is an example of how things should be. But I think from what you've just been saying at the end, you have big questions about self-declarations of independence of this kind.
Yeah, and just to add one. Sorry, I just do things in anecdotes now.
Yeah.
But I went to La Sanaa to try and find out about Sul and Sanag, these two eastern provinces of Somaliland that are Dolbahanti are Hati people, and not Machete.
Hati is right.
Wasengeli. I went into La Sanaa and it was very quiet and peaceful. And the second day there was a tension in the air, and the third day there was some shooting. And the Garad Jama asked me to come, and he said, "Please leave." He said, "Look, we've lived like this for ages. We've always had this problem. Whether we are part of the east or the west, and we've managed it. But because you've arrived, both sides want to show that they're in power, and so they are getting their weapons out and parading. And indeed, there were two police stations in La Sanaa, one at one end and one at the other, inhabited by the two groups, and they were beginning to show how macho they were. And he said, "Look, unless you leave, there could be a fight, because they just want to demonstrate to you that who's in power." So I think there is, but the fact that he, as the Garad, as the leader, could sense this and manage it, and they had managed it for years, suggested to me that, as I said right at the beginning, this has the ingredients just for absolute horrible clan, ethnic warfare, whatever you want to call it. And somehow Somaliland has always managed to avoid it. It's got close, and we're never saying it's got right away from the precipice, but it's never gone over it yet, and I think it's got the skills to avoid it.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Richard. We'll come back to you in just a moment. Since you have quite a lot you want to say in answer to that. But Edward Mason, independent diplomat. I mean, if I could just throw one question to you, I know things you want to say, but does Somaliland, in your view, meet the criteria for international recognition, and why are they finding it so difficult to get it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in legal terms, Somaliland does meet the criteria for recognition, which are things like control of territory, capacity to enter into foreign relations. I think the problem is that recognition of new states is not fundamentally a legal issue, and as we've seen recently on Iraq, Kosovo, Georgia, whatever, you can bend international law to fit what you're doing. So the fundamental problem that Somaliland faces is a political one, and a political one of gaining support for its independence. Well, really, I just wanted to say a few words about the recognition issue for Somaliland, why recognition of Somaliland as a state may be a good thing, why it's such a hard thing for Somaliland to achieve. Just say a little bit about what Somaliland is doing in its efforts to achieve recognition, and perhaps how Somaliland's situation may change, and perhaps at some point recognition be achieved. I should just say who I am. I'm from a non-profit organisation called Independent Diplomat. We are people with diplomatic experience who give advice on diplomatic strategy, and we've been working with the Somaliland government for coming on 3 years now. Just to say something about why recognition may be a good thing for Somaliland. Some people argue that recognition is not a good thing for Somaliland. Some people say that kind of the lack of recognition is what keeps the pressure up on Somaliland, keeps it on a democratic path, and people say kind of the system works well enough as it is. Why change it? I think there are a number of things that I and kind of many Somalilanders would say in response to that. One is that recognising Somaliland as a country would consolidate the peace and stability that it's achieved in a very fragile area of Africa. I think the other crucial point for me is that recognition of Somaliland would facilitate its development. It would open the door to much more bilateral assistance from government donors, in particular budgetary support for the government, which Somaliland is unable to get. It would open the door for much more assistance from international financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. It would also make Somaliland a much better proposition for inward investment. And Somaliland has mineral possibilities. It, in all likelihood, has oil, has great tourist potential on the coast. Recognition would also kind of assist the development of Somaliland's economy. At the moment, Somaliland has no formal banking facilities, for example. And I think one thing that's quite important for me is that recognition, I think, would kind of increase government accountability. I think as a recognised government, there would be more accountability both domestically and also internationally, and the government would be more in the spotlight rather than in the kind of slightly dark corner of an unrecognised state. I think finally, to come to the point that Richard made about Somali irredentism, I think one of the arguments you can make for Somaliland's recognition is that it helps kind of put to bed the idea of all Somali inhabited areas coming together in one state, because you then have, Djibouti as a separate state, Somaliland as a separate state, and the prospects of all Somalis living together in one state are pretty much put to bed. I said I would say something about why recognition is so hard, and it is because it's a political issue, not a legal issue. If you look at how most recognitions of new states have come about in recent years, they're normally as a result of some kind of international process and international engagement, which kind of reflects a sort of head of steam building up internationally. And normally some kind of pressure on the state from which the new state is breaking away or being recognised from, and normally the consent of the state from which the new state is moving apart from. So you've seen this in Montenegro's independence, that there was an organised process led by the European Union, a referendum process in Montenegro, and Serbia consented to that. In the Horn of Africa, you've seen it with Eritrea's independence, where there was a referendum, and again, Ethiopia bought into that process under international supervision and engagement. The problem for Somaliland is that the transitional federal government of Somalia very strongly opposes Somaliland's independence. And you can also argue that the government in Mogadishu is really in no position to give consent or not, because it lacks so much legitimacy in Somalia itself. But that's part of the picture as to why things are hard for Somaliland. Somaliland's location also makes it hard. Internationally, what people say is that Somaliland's status is a matter for the African Union, for Africans. The African Union doesn't have a huge amount of capacity for solving issues like this, even though the African Union Commission has actually sent a fact-finding mission to Somaliland and reported very favourably. It's very hard to kind of get up ahead of steam amongst African Union member states and to actually get something done within the African Union and at summits. And if the issue is raised, then the transitional federal government is a member of the African Union, whereas Somaliland isn't, so it can normally shoot a proposition down and also draw upon the support of neighbouring states who have an interest in good relations with the TFG as the recognised government. That said, Somaliland is making some progress within Africa. The President and Foreign Minister have been received by quite a large number of states in Africa. Somalilanders can often travel on Somaliland passports, and I think awareness of the Somaliland issue is growing. Part of the picture is also a wider international picture. Somalia and Somaliland are very important for the US. Somalia obviously is an important location for kind of the war on terror agenda. The US has engaged in airstrikes in Somalia, and I think looked pretty closely at the recognition issue when the Islamists made headway in the south in 2006 before the Ethiopian intervention, which reinstalled the transitional federal government in power. The UK also takes a stronger interest in Somaliland than most countries. in large part because of the history and Britain's kind of greater understanding. But at the same time, the UK is very reluctant to kind of get too far ahead of the pack. What might change the situation, I think, is probably kind of events on the ground, some kind of crisis, something that would actually make a change seem worthwhile. That may be an Ethiopian withdrawal from Somalia, which is not kind of beyond the bounds of possibility at the moment. It could be Islamists, again, regaining control in the south, which would certainly, I would think, increase American interest in Somaliland. But at the same time, there could just be a general kind of building up of momentum around Somaliland. It's already been 17 years since it redeclared its independence. It's generally recognised as having a good case in legal terms and also in kind of moral terms, because people suffered in Hargeisa, as Richard said, and that's what the people want, and they've shown that in a referendum. And I think, as Michael said, a further round of successful elections would also help the cause. So I think there are possibilities for change, either in kind of the turn of events or just gradually Somaliland kind of building up its case through a good track record.
Well, thanks very much indeed. Questions, please? All right. Just 1 second. And if they're to a specific member of the panel, perhaps you could just say.
Hi. I have 3 small questions about the disputed areas. How does it get more complicated from Somaliland's perspective when an oil company, namely Range Resources, claims part of the disputed area as a block, as an oil block, well, an exploration block? So, how is Somaliland viewing that situation? What do you think the consequences would be if any one of the oil companies that have got licenses in Somaliland would start drilling? Do you think that might heighten tensions if they did find anything that was potentially commercial? And would you mind commenting on the recent livestock issue and how that issue might be resolved, and why the president is still insisting that the Saudi businessman is going to have a monopoly on that?
In a sentence, what is the recent livestock issue?
Just that basically the government has given one Saudi businessman the exclusive rights to all of Somaliland's livestock, and the traders are rioting against this because it's an unfair deal. So, and the president has, despite the rights, has still insisted that he's going to stick to this deal. So I was just wondering why that might be.
The politics of oil and the politics of livestock. Adam Musa Jabil, I think in the first instance anyway, I'll give it to you. Could you just tell us, actually, maybe before you answer the question, how much oil is there in Somaliland? It's obviously attracted the interest of companies anyway, or one specific company. So maybe take up the specific points.
Yeah, well, actually, I could not.
Just to give some background, I was in Puntland in.
You'll need the microphone back for the recording.
Yes, please.
For the webcast.
I was in Puntland in March. Mm-hmm. It was a press trip, and we met with the president. And that was a big issue. This disputed territory. I refer to it as a disputed territory. Sure. Is an issue, and in the recent events in Las Kanud, they had plans to drill there, and they weren't. They've changed that for a number of reasons, including the piracy issue, and they're looking at Daror now. So, yeah.
And since you've been there, how much oil do you understand that there is
in Somaliland? Mm. I know that there were a number of...
Or indeed in this disputed area.
Yeah. Well, I know that basically, when all the oil majors were there prior to independence, they did drill a number of wells. I've got the exact number. I can't remember it now. But there was nothing commercial that was found.
Okay.
So, there are a number of companies now exploring. They're all very quiet about numbers, so I don't have an exact figure.
Okay.
I don't know if they have. They probably do, but it's
Maybe for their own commercial reasons.
Yeah.
Do you want to take those on? Are you able to take those on, the
Yeah.
specific points?
There's no specific point actually in this.
Well, there might have been, actually.
Yeah. We know there are a lot of, deposits in oil in Somaliland, and there is,
Could you speak up just a little bit, yeah. Just so everybody gets the back.
and there is, of course, area of dispute between Puntland and Somaliland. This is, until now, Somaliland is trying to solve these problems peacefully with Puntland.
Are there direct talks between the two?
Not yet. But till now, I think people are avoiding confrontation and looking forward to get a way to solve these problems peacefully. So.
Okay. Does anybody else want to come back very briefly on it? We'll take some of the other.
I'll comment just really briefly on that. I mean, I don't think anyone does know how much oil there is there, although, of course, they have estimates, because oil companies are in the business of making estimates on those kinds of things. There are Chinese concerns drilling in the Ogaden area, and they certainly have an idea of what those reserves hold, and they border both territories. So there is some indication that there is oil there. If someone finds a really commercially exploitable field, it would probably be the worst thing that could happen in the area at the moment. It would destabilize it hugely, and it would suddenly. And already there have been clashes in the border areas between Ethiopia and Somaliland in particular, between clans who are trying to lay claim to ground that they think might have oil under it, and that's not between Somaliland and Puntland, although that's a facet. That's between clans who are trying to say, we want to stake our claim on this area. So it's certainly an issue. I personally hope that they resolve a lot of other things before someone finds a real commercially exploitable oil resource there.
Yeah, Somaliland's looking for resources. As
the wealth would be helpful, but
Real told us.
I hate to think what would happen.
But it carries a curse, as we know from other places. Yeah. Right. Should we go to the back? We have any questions from the back? Lady right at the back.
A couple of times, there was talked about the disputed area in Somaliland, but I fundamentally don't agree with it in the sense that that area have been a problem area for as long as Somali people exist. So within Siad Barre time, before independence. So I don't think really it's an issue as such. And Las Anod, my mother happened to come from there, have been always 50-50. Whether 50% with Siad Barre, 50% with the SNM. So I think we're making big out after the problem in a sense. It is a clan issue than more than any. It's not a state issue. So if you don't tackle it as a local issue, we are going to problematize a problem that is actually not there. So that's one thing I would say about the same problem you have with the borders with Somaliland, Ethiopia. So there's not really proper borders. So is that disputed area? No, because some Isaks live in Ugaden area and they are part of Ethiopian state, and some Isaks live in Somaliland. So that's really something that I really want us to underline.
Could I just ask you, though, I mean, it may have been a problem that's been there forever, but are you worried that in this present climate it could become more of a source of confrontation between Somaliland and Puntland, and could lead to wider violence.
I think it can be, if we don't solve the issue of Somaliland as a issue, the problem you cannot no any international company can come in and do anything, whether it's in Hargeisa. So it's a problematic that you have to first solve the issue of Somaliland as such. And also, it's very dangerous to link the issue of Somaliland democratization with our independence, because whether Somaliland government is democratic enough or not, I have right to have a country, and that is whether Somaliland is not real government, Somaliland government is a dictatorial. It's me to deal as Somaliland with Somaliland government. It's not international government to deal with Somaliland government. But me as Somaliland people, we have the right to have a state.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes.
I think that was by way of a comment a little bit more. Maybe because time is also against us a little bit. Could I take up one or two questions, particularly if they're similar questions, and we can take them around the panel? Staying at the back, we'll come back to the front in a moment. There's a question over there. Yeah.
Jeremy Serra, freelance journalist. The seminar last week was focusing on the south central Somalia and the conflict, and when I raised the question of diplomatic recognition and independence for the north, I got a quite antipathetic response from the guy who was from the Youth League. What I didn't really get was the psychology of, I can understand why the Somalilanders in the north want their independence and want to revert to the old boundaries, but of the south, why they want to hold on to this union, which by any standard seems to be a total failure.
Okay, let's take that specific one around to those of you who want to take it up. Michael?
I guess Richard was talking before. There's a big word there, the Somali word, Somaliland, the big Somalia, the idea of a greater Somalia.
Yes.
That's the reason that people are so wedded to the idea of unity. It's a problematic concept because it's never had a political expression as a single unified state. But that idea of a single unified state has been transposed onto the idea of Somaliland, of the bigger Somalia, the greater Somalia, and is behind the southern idea, the five-pointed star on the flag, which incidentally the Somaliland flag still has a five-pointed star. I'm not quite sure what the significance of that is, but and actually, I mean, one of the most provocative, one of the things that sparked the civil war in the north was a ceremony where a group of people that became called the Hargeisa group. One of the things they did amongst many was to dare on the anniversary of independence from Britain, 1960, the 1960 independence. They hoisted a one pointed star on a flag, which was considered extremely antagonistic, provocative. So this idea of Somaliland has, and Ayan can talk about it from a much more personal perspective than I can, or any of the other Somalis here, but it has a huge emotional weight. But it's, as I said, problematic because it's never had a political expression in the sense that the transitional federal government and many others who argue for unity would like to think it could have. Just quickly, the British are popular, but they also betrayed Somaliland in the eyes of the Somalis by giving away, particularly the Hode, which is the area, just the grazing areas just to the south of the Somaliland border. They actually gave away a lot more than that, but it was the Hode that was the big problem. All of that feeds into this sense of grievance, justified sense of grievance, I have to say, and into the Somaliland dream.
Okay. Good.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Take one or two
I think the issue of unity is very closely related to the other problems in the region. Eritrean Ethiopia conflict, Sudan conflict. The fundamental problem here starts from that sort of Somali nationalism we had in the 60s, 40s, which called for unification of all Somali ethnic group in the Horn of Africa, not only through peaceful means but also by means of force. That was the basis of Somali irredentism ideology. Now, that, out of this extreme ideology, there were a lot of wars, conflict, Somali-Ethiopian wars. There were three big conflicts between Somalia and United Somalia and Ethiopia. There were problems with Somalia and Kenya. There was claims on Somali government to Djibouti, for Djibouti as a part of Somali, Greater Somalia. And the main problem, is based here on the issue of solving these problems through violence, not peaceful negotiation. So the Somaliland independence, Somaliland recognition will stand for a peaceful solution, because Somaliland no more claims territory from Ethiopia or Kenya or Djibouti.
Okay.
So I think this is Somaliland independent.
So
Will be, a means to solve the big problem of the Horn of Africa.
Okay, Richard wants to.
Actually, I wanted to ask a question. Am I allowed to do that?
Of course.
I wanted to ask Edward,
Yeah.
what, as a diplomat, what can Somaliland get short of a seat at the United Nations? I mean, can it get help from the World Food Programme, the World Bank, the IMF? I mean, as a sort of honorary member without a vote at the UN, what could you get it short of that seat at the UN?
Well, I mean, Somaliland is already kind of getting things at the moment. I think the step short of recognition as a state is acceptance as an entity in its own right that works and deserves engagement with by the outside. And that's all already happening. Somaliland gets a great proportion of the development assistance for Somalia. It's entered into agreements, memorandums of understanding with foreign governments, and it does get assistance from the World Bank. So I mean, there are things short of recognition, and there are different kinds of recognition as well. I mean, there's like at the moment there's the Kosovo recognition, which is a halfway house. It's got recognised by 45 states. There are nearly 200 in the UN. Kosovo has no prospect.
If it were to happen, it could be a sort of incremental. Process, maybe. I'm even more conscious now of the time issue, but a couple of people here have been asking very. Yep. I'm just going to go there first, if I may, and then I'll come to you. And then
Hi, my name is Amal, and I'm not attached with any organisation. My question is to the panel. Where do you see Somaliland within the next 5 years, 10 years? And what will the impact be if southern Somalia, they get their act together and there's a peace and there's a government?
Okay. Can we just go round? Let's do our sort of sentence or two of each of you, actually. Yeah. I'll start with this end. We just
okay,
moved to Richard.
I'll have a. Two things would worry me if Somali irredentism happened and with oil and agreement between Somali and it sorted its problems and got rich. I think the first thing it would do would be to invade Ethiopia.
Right. Within a 5 to 10 year time?
Things move fast in that part. I mean, I think that they would certainly try and take back the Ogaden. You'd have another Ethiopia-Somali war, which that's the sort of downside. But I think I mean that's a slightly flippant and cynical as cynical as Somalis are. I think I would hope that Somaliland actually gets a, because it's got immensely talented people, and if they were to come back, many of them come back and bring all those skills back. I mean, it could be another of those countries that, with its professional skills, actually becomes a call centres. I mean, the sky's the limit. I mean, it could become a sort of banking centre for the Middle East. It could. I mean, there are all sorts of things I think it could do. I mean, if it's stable and it's got confidence and skills, then I think it could do really, really well.
Okay, 5 to 10 years, Michael.
I think the only way you can really answer that, and I'm not going to do it this way because it'll take too long, but is to suggest scenarios, because there are a number of different possibilities. In some ways, I think, from a personal perspective, I think the best outcome would be continued incremental steps towards recognition in its many facets. Ultimately, the decision about whether Somaliland is a wholly independent country or what kinds of ties it has with other Somali areas, I think is something that can be left a bit for the future and certainly needs to be negotiated by Somalilanders. But as things stand, it is de facto independent. If it can continue to consolidate the institutions that are in place and continue to extend its relationships with external bodies, both states and non-state actors, and introduce things like a banking and postal system, then I think it could, as Richard says, be very successful.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is another scenario which we did not actually address it, and that is the development of Islamist movement in the region. This really was a very big challenge. As we see now in this situation
within Somaliland, are you saying there's an Islamist strand in politics within Somaliland?
I mean generally in the region, and especially.
But does it exist within Somaliland as well?
I mean the problem in the south, in Somalia.
Yeah, no. As you make the point, I just wondered whether there is actually an Islamist strand within politics in Somaliland as well.
Well, there is Islamists, but the Islamist movement in Somaliland, they are dealing with schools, Islamic schools,
sure.
Islamic universities. There are a lot of mosques under building, construction.
And in your view, a positive or a negative influence?
They have they fund this from Arab countries, from Saudi Arabia. Not, I don't think these days from the government, but rich individuals are giving, funds to these schools. Well, as to whether they pose immediate threat to Somaliland independence, this actually will, the government has in control, in fact, in the media, in the military, in the police, but the danger, the real threat will come when the Islamic movement in the south get upper hand anywhere in the region. At that time, there is a possibility, there is a scenario that they can overtake the whole of south. They can come up to Puntland, Bosaso, this area. They have their own bases, and with this especially important with the reluctance of the international community to bring peace-keeping forces into south. And this is a very serious issue because, as you see, they are gaining ground in the south. A few days ago, they take over Kismayo. Sure. They are moving toward this Galkayo, and who knows tomorrow.
So that would help Somaliland if the international community were to strengthen the peacekeeping presence is a very small one at the moment, isn't it, in the south?
Yeah, of course. Generally, if peace is consolidated in the south, that is generally a positive development.
That's a very interesting point we raised at the last minute. Yeah. We have one more person to deal with your question. That's right. Everybody, the 5 to 10 years scenario.
Sure. I mean, your question was about Somalia as well as Somaliland, and yeah. I mean, I think the prospects for Somalia in the next 10 years, as it looks from now, are very bleak. You know, there's no sign of the situation improving there, and yeah, there's no sign of any willingness from the international community to invest heavily in peacekeeping or whatever. So I think the most likely outcome for Somalia is status quo or worse, sadly. For Somaliland, I think there are probably a couple of scenarios, as the other panelists really have said. I think there is a prospect of recognition within that kind of 5 to 10 year timescale. Some of the reasons I've outlined earlier, either in response to what happens in the south, or kind of just a growing acceptance that Somaliland is a good force and worth supporting. But I think, as Adam says, I think there's equally a possibility that somehow Somaliland could be kind of sucked into the maelstrom of the south, possibly through, as he said, Islamism, possibly through some kind of military confrontation with the south. So I think there's a temptation to think the Somaliland issue can always be parked, they're okay. I think there are risks that Somaliland could go wrong as well if it's left unaddressed.
Thank you very much indeed. I do apologise. I know you were trying to ask a question, but maybe you could do so informally with any of the panellists afterwards, and anybody else who was still waiting to ask one. But I'm afraid we're out of time. Yeah, but I'm sure you can chat to people afterwards. But thank you very much indeed for your questions and for coming along, for listening, and thank you on your behalf to the panel as well. The one thing that hasn't got a mention, and maybe my memory is distorted, but my memory of trips to Somaliland is of the importance of poetry in all sorts of ways. The importance of poetry in political life, in society as a whole. We've passed the whole evening on an hour and a half discussion without mentioning it, but maybe I'm being nostalgic about it.
You're right.
There's a Somaliland festival.
Yeah.
Which will include poetry.
Wonderful, right, good.
Stand up and tell us about it.
Yeah, actually, it's Somali with festival, including Somali and Somaliland. So for poetry, music, and stuff from October. So everywhere.
Great.
So it was welcome.
And I know poetry is not exclusive to Somaliland, but but thank you very much indeed. Thanks to everybody.